There we go. So my name is Duane O'Brien. I run the Office of Open Source for the PayPal Oasis Group, which is owned by Denise Cooper. Some of you may know her. Oasis in this context stands for Open Source, Accessibility, the Safe Project, InnerSource, and Stuff, which is whatever we happen to want to put our hands on.
So it's no relationship to the standards body?
No relationship to the standards body whatsoever. It just happened to be a nice acronym for what we own. So quick overview of the talk. I'm going to give a crash course through what InnerSource is, because some of you may not be familiar with the term or how we're going to be using it in the talk. I'm going to talk about the motivations of corporations when they get involved in open source projects and what the metrics involved in that context can be. I'm going to then talk about InnerSource projects or initiatives, why companies would do that, what those corresponding metrics would be, and then we're going to kind of stack them up against each other to see how and why they're different. So my timer did not start. All right. So quick crash course on InnerSource, and for the context of this, we're going to talk about a large, mature software company. So this is the kind of place where you would be rolling out an InnerSource initiative. And in this company, you've got a large core stack of technology with a lot of deep specialization, a lot of engineers who are very familiar with it. And then you might have a regional team like down in Brazil, and they need to get some kind of feature into this core technology. So an engineer in Brazil would write a bunch of code, they would submit a pull request, and what tends to happen is the core team sits on it, right? Because the engineers on the core team have a full sprint's worth of work that they're supposed to be doing. They may not have been expecting this pull request from Brazil, and it'll sit there and it'll hang around for a while until eventually Brazil's big cheese manager here says, hey, what's wrong with this feature? Why isn't it getting in? The engineer explains, well, I submitted my pull request to core. I don't know what the problem is. His big cheese manager goes over and yells at the big cheese manager for the core team, hey, you're blocking my people. And the big cheese manager yells back down, just get the patch merged. The engineer on core rewrites the patch, gets it submitted into core. So what did we learn out of this process? Well, we learned that engineers don't like interrupt-driven work. We learned that big cheeses like to yell at each other, but we don't capture very much out of that. So for InnerSource, we think of it as the Apache way of building software, but for software that's only going to be never going to be open sourced by a company. This is not an Apache project. We learn lessons from the Apache way, and we take them to how we build software inside a corporation. We're going to focus for this conversation specifically on trusted committers. The idea that for a given team inside a company, not everybody gets to merge code. Right? There is a subset of those committers, of those engineers, whose full-time job it is to make sure that the code that does get merged looks right, and whether that's mentoring new contributors from outside the team or acting as mentors within the team. So in this context, the trusted committer would say, hey, Brazil team, thanks for this pull request. We'd like to get this merged when we can. Here's what we need. We need to see these tests. You need to adhere to these coding guidelines. You need to understand this particular bit of code because it looks like you don't understand what the repercussions are going to be down the line. And they would iterate over this pull request doing some actual mentorship. Now, this can be a rewarding process, but a lot of the rewards feel like they're primarily for the person in Brazil because my patch got merged, right? I'm no longer getting yelled at by my big cheese boss. I get my work done, I get to go on about my life. And now, yeah, the big cheeses, they get to go do something else. We didn't have to get our bosses involved in this process. They're not upset with either one of us. They get to go play golf, whatever it is big cheese people do. So what's in this for the trusted committer? Because this is an engineer who's spending most of their time not engineering. Right? They're mentoring, they're helping other people get better. Well, this isn't to say there's nothing for the trusted committer, because some of the things that will come out of this are refactoring clues. If the same teams or different teams keep tripping over the same parts of the code over and over, that's a pretty good indication that that code needs to be simplified, broken apart, made easier to understand. The other thing that comes out of this is the idea of some lazy documentation. Been an engineer, know lots of engineers, ask an engineer to write documentation, and they will have a million things that are more important to do. But when this conversation happens in the context of a pull request, you didn't have to tell them to write anything, but now there is some documentation. So when the Singapore team comes along and says, hey, we have a feature we need to get into core 2, the trusted committer can say, this looks a little bit like what this other team was working on. Why don't you go read through this fine pull request that we did, and that will help you understand what needs to happen. Or the trusted committer can say, hey, engineers in Brazil, since we just helped you with this process, would you mind sitting down with the team in Singapore and helping them through the same process? And now you're starting to grow the idea of trusted committers within the company who can actually contribute into the core stack. So more information at InnerSourceCommons.org. There's a free ebook there that you can get that came out by O'Reilly last OSCON. So that's InnerSource in a nutshell, and we're going to go kind of straight from that into companies that get involved in open source and what their motivations and metrics would be. And I want to give a disclaimer here. I work for a big corporation, right? The perspective I'm going to bring to this is as someone who runs an office of open source at a large corporation. There's debate on whether corporate involvement in open source is a good thing or a bad thing. Not going to touch on that, but that's the perspective, that's the lens I'm looking through when I talk about the stuff that's coming up. So the first thing we need to understand about open source in a large corporation is we have overlords, right? I have an overlord. Her name is Denise Cooper. Simon, don't tell her I call her an overlord.
I already told him.
There are vice presidents. They have overlords that have C's in front of their names, chief executives, and they are ultimately beholden to millions of overlords in the form of shareholders. And the thing about these overlords is they all have agendas. Because whenever a corporation gets involved in open source, whether it's a program, whether it's a project, they want something, right? People can be altruistic about these things, but corporations really can't, okay? So we have overlords, they have agendas. They also have budgets. There's a lot of money coming in, there's a lot of money going out. And wherever you have budgets, you have the potential for budget cuts. And if you're sitting at a table with people who are running a diversity program, and people who are running a marketing campaign, and people who are running a replatforming initiative, and the diversity group can say, we've had this measurable effect on our workforce, and the marketing group can say, we've driven this much revenue through this campaign, and the replatforming group can say, we're seeing this much speed increase because we're this far into our work, and the open source office says, let me take a half an hour to explain how all of this is going, you become a very good candidate to have your budget cut. So let's come back to agendas. What do I mean when I say agendas? Because with overlords and agendas, it starts to sound like we're petting evil cats and twirling our mustaches. It isn't always like that, right? You might have employees engage in open source because you want them to develop their own skills, right? You want them to become better collaborators, you want them to work with technologies that the company doesn't have, or you just want them to work on passion projects that they find personally rewarding. You might be in it for the publicity, right? You might be a company who has acted poorly previously in the open source space and you want to rehabilitate your image, so you want to spin up and participate in good faith in existing projects, okay? There could be strategy considerations. Maybe you want to release an open source project as a way to undermine a competitor and to drive more adoption in that direction. Or you might be attempting to steer a particular technology in one direction or another. This is not a comprehensive list of why companies get involved in open source, but it's just some reason. So when you look at these reasons that companies would get involved in open source, let's take a look at the metrics. Did I go backwards? I did. Employee satisfaction is one. If you've ever worked in a large corporation, you've probably seen this question of, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the least likely and 10 being the most likely, how likely are you to recommend this place as a good place to work to your friends and former colleagues, right? Or you might have seen that about a web app that you use somewhere. So you might poll for employee satisfaction to see if they are getting some reward out of working on these projects. You might engage with an external group to see how your public image is changing over time. Someone like Gartner or a number of other groups. You might take a look at the adoption rate of the project that you're attempting to push and see how it's scaling up. You might take some measurements on your community size based off of some of the numbers that we talked about this morning and some of the metrics that we'll talk about this afternoon as well. You might also be counting how many trusted committers you have in your project. Is that number going up or down over time? It's not the only indicator for health, but it can be a useful one, and so on and so on. Again, not a comprehensive list, just some things that you might measure But let's take a look at why a company gets involved in an InnerSource program. So again, I will say that this is a large, mature company problem. So small companies generally don't need something or do something like this because there's not enough people to have these different roles and responsibility. Everybody knows what's going on in a small company, right? And it's generally not a young company problem, right? Because young companies have grown up in the age of GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, and this is just the way they're used to working. Everybody can see the code, everybody can contribute into the code. So again, we're talking about large, mature companies with overlords and agendas, right, and budgets. So what are the problems that some of these companies have? Well, one of these problems is the idea of technological silos. You have one whole group, and all they do is work on this aspect of the company's technology, right? And so if you want to get anything done inside that group, you have to go in through the bottom of the silo or down through the top, talking to the cheese again. Or you might have a bunch of legacy code that's been hanging around for a while, very critical to the success of the company. Maybe some engineers are a little fuzzy on what it does anymore because it's been around for a long time. In addition to this, and kind of correlated to the idea of the silos, is that there are a lot of politics in a large company. There's just less room for politics in a smaller company. So you have managers who have built sort of their territories, and they want to maintain control over their territories, and so we'll sometimes say no to a feature just as a way to exert their influence. So reasons companies of this size with these problems might try InnerSource are to address some of these same problems. You want to bust those silos, right? And this is easier to do when engineers are talking to each other and you're able to submit code into another group. You might be trying to take your legacy code and to break it up into smaller digestible components. You can modularize it, understand it, and get rid of it, and modernize it. You might be trying to build bridges from one group to another. Again, something that happens easier with engineers sometimes than with managers. But you also might be attempting to build more full-stack engineers, right? Engineers who understand more about what's going on inside the company rather than just their own little technological area. So if we look at the difference in the motivations between why a company gets involved in open source and why they might do an InnerSource program, they're pretty different reasons. And it makes sense in that context that the metrics would, of course, be different. So things you might measure for an InnerSource program, we're going to take another look at that trusted committership, right? Committer growth. Outside of an InnerSource program in a company, the number of committers on a project is not going to change over time unless you hire somebody or fire somebody. It's going to be flat, right? But the people who can contribute into the code base, if you see that trending up over time, you know that you're starting to see some success with your InnerSource program. Another thing that would be interesting to look at is the idea of mentorship cycles, right? As I engage with you on getting your code into the right shape to be merged into this core code base, and as we continue to engage, over time it should take fewer cycles for us to do that, right? Because you're learning more about it. Well, if I'm doing that with you, and 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 we take a look at all of those over time, we should see that each time I bring someone on, it takes me less time to get them up to speed because I'm becoming a better mentor, right? So if you're attempting to grow better mentors and more mentors inside the company, this can be a useful thing to measure. Velocity, right? How much is the team being thrown off by interrupt-driven work? In theory, we should see velocity improvements over the life of the team as they engage with InnerSource, because they're getting features that weren't originally coded by their team, coming in from an external group. Who gets credit for that, depending on your process. But there are also, again, less interrupt-driven work, less panicked fire drills coming in and saying you have to fix this because the big cheese is yelling at you. You would also look at the types of collaborations that are happening inside the company, right? The group of people that an engineer interacts with in a company should be going up over the course of time in an InnerSource program. You also might take a look at the individual status of an engineer, right? How many different pieces of the code are they able to commit code into? So what's their reach throughout the stack, right? A good indicator that you're creating full stack engineers if they are able to commit code at will into different parts of the company. And again, so on and so on. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list, just some of the things that you might measure for an InnerSource program. So last couple of looks here. When we look at the motivations for why a company engages in an InnerSource program versus an open source program, because the motivations are going to be very different, the metrics are going to be end up being very different. We still pay very close attention to trusted committers in both cases, but for different reasons, right? And so that's what I had. I was actually told it was 20 minutes, not 30 minutes, which leaves us plenty of time for questions, then get back on schedule. So that's me. Thank you.